In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains why it is important to take care of yourself in life.
I think it was a TED Talk by Franz de Waal, Fransdewaal, and he studied political behavior in chimpanzees. But one of the things that de Waal pointed out was that the most empathic chimpanzees in a chimpanzee troop are actually the most dominant males. They're the ones who do the most comforting and the most care. Like the females are more empathic than the males on average. But across all of the chimpanzees, the most dominant males are the ones that show the most empathic responses. And that's part of de Waal's, and he's not the only animal ethologist, someone who studies the natural behavior of animals. He's not the only person to point this sort of thing out, is that the ability to move forward in a hierarchy is dependent on far more than power and aggression. And it's dependent on reciprocity and friendship, but also, especially in the case of human beings, on skill. Because hopefully when we organize our hierarchies and we're attempting to solve complex problems by setting up a hierarchy that allows for competition and cooperation, that the hierarchy organizes itself so that the most competent people rise to the top. And I actually think that generally speaking, that's true. I mean, the selection process isn't perfect, and it's marred by, you could say, the proclivity to select people for reasons other than their fundamental competence. And that might be their attractiveness or their extroversion or their height or their charisma, their self-confidence. It might be their race or their gender or their sexuality too, in situations where true prejudice plays a role. But that only happens when the hierarchies have become corrupt, because obviously it's in everyone's best interests, if we're trying to solve complex problems, that the most competent people are the ones that have the opportunity to rise to the top. And I actually think we do a damn good job of that in the West, which is why almost everything that we do in the West works, why everything is reliable, and why the power is always on, and why our electronic technology works, and why our society in general works. And you can be cynical about that if you want, but I don't know what you would compare the functionality of our societies to, because things are way better than they were 150 years ago. They're getting better very, very rapidly as Western ideas of production and private property and honesty and integrity, I would say as well, spread around the world, especially now that the more radical socialist ideas that were pushed by people like the Soviets have declined, at least to some degree, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, anyways, this is the sort of thing that's discussed at the talks, or that's rule one. And, rule two, I talk to people about taking care of themselves like they're someone who they have responsibility for. And that's not a political issue too. It's an injunction to assuming that you have a certain intrinsic value, and that it's necessary for that value to manifest itself, for you to push yourself against the world, to challenge yourself, because otherwise what you're capable of won't manifest itself. It has to be developed. It has to be called forth by necessity, right? You have to pick a hard problem and try to solve it and push yourself against it and you have to try to do that truthfully and responsibly in order for what it is that you're intrinsically capable of and composed of to come to the forefront. And that seems like a very positive thing as far as I'm concerned, to encourage people to be responsible for themselves and for other people, and also to point out that you have a moral responsibility to do so for yourself just as you do for others. And I think that message has been very helpful to people. At least that's what they've told me. And it's predicated, the rule is predicated on the old Judeo-Christian idea, the oldest idea in some sense, that that there's a relationship between logos, which is truthful speech and communication, and bringing things into being from chaotic potential. That's the idea that's put forward in Genesis. And also the idea that men and women alike are made in the image of God, which suggests that, like God, we have the capability of affecting potential, affecting the possible future and turning it into the actual present, and that we do that, at least in part, as a consequence of our ethical choices. And then I'll give you one more example. In Rule 10, which is be precise in your speech, I point out that that the aims that you have in your life, the ethical aims, and those are the aims that direct your actions, also direct your perceptions, that this is true at a neurophysiological level, and that much of the way that the world manifests itself to you is a consequence of the structure of your ethics. So it's your ethical structure that's instantiated neurophysiologically that serves as an intermediary between the world of phenomena, let's say objective phenomena, and your perception of that. And you see the world through an ethical lens. And one of the things that suggests, and I outlined this in Rule 6, is that if the world looks to you like a dismal and terrible place, and you're nihilistic and depressed and hopeless and all of that, I mean, there can be physiological reasons for that. You might be ill, but if it's a psychological issue, it's certainly possible that at least part of the reason that everything appears to you in that light is because your ethical structure is not well formulated. It's incoherent, it's nihilistic, it isn't predicated on the idea, for example, that people have some spark of divine virtue and that everyone is valuable in that right, and that we all have the possibility to make a genuine contribution to the world, or at least to stop it from degenerating any more than it has to into a kind of hell. So anyways, that's a very long answer to that question. But it's so interesting to me that the journalists who interview me have no curiosity about why it is that so many people are coming to watch my lectures. It's like the curiosity has been boiled out of them in some sense, because it certainly makes me curious. Every time I go on stage and there's 3,500 people there, I'm curious about why they're there. And so we have a discussion about all these things that I've been talking about. And I can tell you too that the one thing that really brings the house to dead silence, which is very much worth paying attention to, is the discussion. Anytime I have a discussion about the relationship between responsibility and meaning, because one of the fundamental theses of 12 Rules for Life and also of Maps of Meaning is that because life is essentially tragic in its fundamental essence, you need a sustaining meaning that's deep and profound, and deep and profound enough to get you through bad times, because there will be very bad times in your life. There'll be death, and there'll be illness, and there'll be disappointment of all sorts. And there'll be just the standard difficulties of life in the world to contend with. And you really must have something that's profound and powerful to set up against that. And I think that your voluntary adoption of the struggle to improve being is the proper antidote to that. And that the best way to do that is to live responsibly and truthfully. I truly believe that.